Welcome to Breaking the Narrative, a Stand With Us Canada podcast. I'm your host, Jesse Primorano, and in each episode, we'll dive into the fight against antisemitism and the delegitimization of Israel. From student leaders to community advocates, we'll explore how people are standing up and making a difference. New episodes drop every other Thursday, so let's get into this week's conversation. Welcome back to another episode of Breaking the Narrative. My name is Jesse Primorano, and I'm your host, and really looking forward to today's episode. As we've talked about so much through this series, what started as a campus issue in the mid to early 2000s has really become a high school, a middle school, and an elementary school issue as it relates to anti-Semitism permeating our classrooms, distancing Jewish students from their peers, isolating them in their classrooms. And we know our listeners are very invested in this issue, so really excited to have a couple of experts today, folks from here in Toronto who co-founded the Jewish Educators and Family Association, commonly known as JEFA. We have Kucharczuk and Tamara Gottlieb. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Great to have you. JEFA is a fairly new organization. I think founded, can you tell us when were you guys founded?
Very new. It's the organization we never wanted to start.
we look forward to ending it, actually.
We do.
And but it's been, 18 months, let's say?
18 months.
About that, yeah.
We met in a school gym. A little bit about me. I have 4 kids, and all of them have muscular dystrophy, and I actually run a patient support group for almost 2,000 people with the same form of muscular dystrophy that my kids have around the world. And so I'm not unfamiliar with advocacy for people who, really have a lot of pain and face a lot of barriers. I also have, as a professional background, I was a consultant and a strategist, and I did some work for the teacher regulator in Ontario, so I'm fairly familiar with licensing standards and some of the rules around teaching. And in that capacity, people would call me over the past 10 years when there were issues, and just from time to time I get a phone call, can you help me with this? Can you help me with that? After October 7th, things exploded, and I got a call from a parent at Aaron's school.
My kid's school, yeah.
And so we actually met in the gym, and he and I, we just were listening to the senior leadership of the TDSB virtue signal.
To answer very basic questions.
Absolutely.
It was like, talk to the community about what happens when there's an incident of anti-Semitism, and they would say, oh, well, it gets filed in the hate portal, and then that gets sent directly to my email inbox. And then parents asked, and then what? What do you do when it's after it hits your email inbox? Just silence. Just really struggled to answer those questions, and it was coming out of that meeting that I met a lot of parents, both at my school and at other local schools, who were also experiencing a lot of anti-Semitism in the aftermath of October 7th, and met Tamara in that gym, and it's been quite the ride.
Yeah, one thing led to another, and we have no free time. But we actually thought maybe we could handle things less formally. I think we tried to just do the research and keep the community aware. And then as a few weeks and months progressed, the breadth of the problem was very daunting, and we realized that like literally neither of us wanted to start an organization.
Well, who would want to have to start an organization, speaking up on behalf of any kind of hatred, but specifically against your own community?
Absolutely. And the Jewish community specifically has a lot of organizations. Before JEFA was founded, there were 1.2 Jewish orgs for every Jew in the community, right? So we were like, surely there is another organization who is doing this work. And so we began by actually trying to be a bridge between parents and teachers and existing organizations. That was our first model. The first model was, okay, it's just about finding the right fit. Maybe people have troubles expressing their situation succinctly or presenting the right material. So we literally had meetings with other Jewish organizations saying, this family needs a lawyer, this kid was assaulted, this family needs a lawyer, this kid was honestly haunting stories.
Sure.
And when we weren't able to really help the community in that capacity, JEFA was born.
So let me just, take a step back if I can. You started very informally as people who felt that they understood the, rules and regs around the TDSB, things that kept our educators, and our boards of those schools sort of accountable for, ensuring the well-being of our students. For the average person in the community, we don't know the extent of these bylaws and right and
that was me before October 7th, right. And actually before whenever that was at the beginning of November, when got a call from my neighbor about the incidents of anti-Semitism that her kid was going through at my local school. And I'm a lawyer by training, and so my immediate instinct was, okay, let's find the policy that they're supposed to apply. Let's see what it says, and let's hold them accountable. Let's say, here's what it says you're supposed to do. Why are you not doing this? And then I read the policies, and I was shocked to learn that they were following their policies. Yeah. Their policies do divide children up into oppressors and oppressed, and treat children differently on the basis of that status. And so here was a situation where the Jewish student was being bullied by someone that the school board would consider, an oppressed group. And so, punishment as per their own policy, they need to not punish that student despite that student engaging in repeated and blatant anti-Semitism.
So I want to talk about that. I want to get into this whole oppressor versus oppressed and DEI and on that whole conversation. But before, just to help the listeners to give the framing, because I cut you off. You were talking about the next iteration of actually forming JEFA. So what did that look like in the beginning, and what is today's iteration of JEFA? What are you achieving? What are your goals? What are you working towards? What do you do? For lack of, not that I don't know, but for our listeners.
I'm a Jewish mother. I hear people's problems. I tell them that I find solutions. Don't worry, baby. I'm going to fix it. I don't know what to say, but in seriousness, I would say that triaging is still a significant part of what we do, although to be candid, I think the community now understands a lot more clearly 18 months out that the school boards are not in fact often breaking rules, or in fact following their own rules to a T. And so parents have gotten better at taking our training, which we've provided, and guidance, and running with it themselves. And so then part of our focus is really policy change, is how do we create a system that's fair and provides equal rights for all students. Would you say that's a fair answer?
Yeah, I think that's right. It sort of evolved from helping individual families, and we still do that as incidents arise, but it was a lot at the beginning of just people reaching out saying, I tried contacting X and Y and Z and nobody got back to me. Can you help? Like, what do I do? And then we would just be helping a lot of individual families. And then as we increasingly realized that these are really deep-rooted problems within the policies of the school boards, it is turned a lot into advocating for policy change.
And I would just add one more thing to that. I would say another area of focus for us is helping Jewish educators. To any Jewish educators who are watching right now, it is a very dark time for Jewish professionals in education. Very, very difficult for them to identify as Jewish in their schools, to forget about being proud of their Jewish identity, even to be safe sometimes in a school environment. And anyone who follows the social media postings of many of the union leaders and sees the horrible libel that is posted on some of these social media accounts knows that Jewish educators who've signed away their individual rights through collective bargaining, right? They can't hire a lawyer for themselves because they're represented by the union, but so many of those union executives have an intense animosity towards our people.
Right. And so you've gone in a sense from doing a lot of reactive sort of work to being more proactive to get ahead of the problem, which I think is so important for our community, right? Is that we can't always be sort of, chasing our tail and dealing with one problem at a time. We need to find a way to, buck the trend and to nip things things in the bud in that way. And again, the average person who is a doctor, a lawyer, whatever it is they're doing with their full-time, and they have, a family, they don't have the time to understand the policies of the TDSB to the extent that you do. And even, like you said, teachers, right? These unions are, very complex to navigate. They are inherently anti-Semitic in so many ways, as we see, across unions of all sorts. And so what are you doing? How are you able to help teachers in particular? Because I think listeners know the types of anti-Semitism that our students have been dealing with in the board. And I want to save our time in this conversation for other things. But for teachers, I don't think we often think about, I know about my girlfriend is a teacher in the TDSB. So I know firsthand, but I don't think many people think about being the adult in the room and you're still dealing with anti-Semitism, because when you leave the classroom, there's a whole other world waiting for you out there too. So can you tell us a bit about sort of what you've been hearing from teachers, how you've been able to try to help them? I mean, I know it's a difficult uphill battle, but what are you hearing?
So I would say it's a couple of things. So one for teachers is just this idea, and I've heard this from teachers repeatedly, that they feel targeted, that there's just an undue amount of investigations on Jewish teachers. We would love for the school boards to share these numbers, and as the Minister of Education in Ontario has placed 5 school boards under supervision, this is an excellent time for the supervisors who've been appointed to come in and get those numbers. Exactly what percentage of Jewish identifying educators have been placed on leave and or have been investigated in the past few years. This is a really important statistic that I think needs to be investigated further. So that's one. And then 2 is just this whole idea of, to what extent does Jewish identity constitute a form of hate speech as it relates to this new equity policy, anti-Palestinian racism. So we have had incidents of teachers who've been investigated, questioned, sometimes disciplined for things like invoking an Israeli flag for Jewish Heritage Month, a map of Israel for Jewish Heritage Month. And so Jewish educators are naturally quite concerned. And I know that, and I don't mean to redirect this away from teachers at all, but when it comes to students, I think that some of the obvious examples, things like swastikas, things like death chants to Zionists, death to the IDF, are obvious to parents, but there are other incidents of anti-Semitism that are less obvious to parents, right? And I'm thinking about how the entire discussions that happen very regularly now in school systems about who's an oppressor, who's a colonist, what does white privilege mean? Just one example, Jesse, if anybody who's watching this takes a moment to open their browser and go to the TDSB equity policy, you can read the equity policy's definition of white supremacist. And it provides that, there's this one definition of white supremacist is like the KKK, but there's a whole second definition about people in the white or oppressor or dominant group having unearned institutionalized privilege. And that's this whole subtext of Jews having unearned institutionalized privilege. And that's very heavy and disturbing to place on our kids in a K-12 system.
Yeah, it plays into the tropes that we've been hearing for thousands of years. That's right. But it ties into what you said before as well about covert versus overt anti-Semitism, right? It's very clear swastika's a swastika, but what they're learning now is that they can't put swastikas up on the walls and they can't call kids dirty Jews in school. I mean, they are anyways, but so they're finding other ways to do the same thing. And in many ways, that's what Zionism has become, is it's been weaponized as a tool to call somebody a dirty Jew without calling them a word that they're not able to use. And so I'm sure you're seeing tons of this, in the TDSB all the time. Policy-wise, we could talk APR as a sort of means of highlighting what's going on there, right? Is that we're all against racism in any form, right? Yeah. You asked me, of course I don't want Palestinians to, people who identify as Palestinians to feel any kind of racism anywhere. But when that policy puts my own community at risk and erases my history, that's when I draw the line, right? And so I know you are, have been dealing with this. You talk about being more proactive, and I know you've been working on this policy, and not everyone necessarily understands sort of where these issues come from. They just know that the Jewish community is very unhappy with this policy. So do you want to talk a bit about the APR? I should probably call it its full name, anti-Palestinian racism. Which again, in theory, sounds like a beautiful thing. How come it's receiving a negative reaction from members of the Jewish community?
And Aaron, I remember when you explained it to me, because I didn't understand why it had so much weight in the school system. If you start with that, with how the DEI policies are in fact the code of conduct, it's like that whole explanation. It's so helpful.
Right. So just to start that. So this the APR policy, right, is really just the only definition of APR that I've seen has been the one put forward by the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association, and that definition, I don't have it in front of me, but it says that it is intended to protect Palestinian narratives. I am not aware of any other group whose narratives are protected. Their human dignity, their worth as a person, absolutely. That is what, anti-racism laws are intended to protect.
Right.
It's not to protect certain versions of stories. And so this concept of anti-Palestinian racism is it's embedded in several school boards now, is defined in a way that it's racist to say something contrary to the Palestinian narrative, as if there's a single one. So it's suddenly racist to disagree with the Nakba narrative. It's suddenly racist to claim that Israel is the indigenous homeland of the Jewish people, because doing so disrupts or denies the Palestinian narrative that it's their indigenous land.
So can I interrupt you for 1 second just to say that it's not only that by protecting quote unquote this Palestinian narrative, we're offered no protection of our own narrative, because at the same time it's erasing.
No form of racism covers people's narratives.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So, but this one does. Right. And
but it does it specifically at the extent.
Those narratives don't even need to be rooted in truth.
Right.
Right. And now it's a form of racism to say something contrary to that narrative, and racism is a code of conduct violation. So in saying that you disagree with the narrative of the Nakba, or pointing out that actually the war started when all of the Arab countries attacked Israel, that's now punishable. That's now an act of racism that you can be disciplined for.
The revisionist history, right? Like,
that's right.
You're directly in a space of academia where we're intended to be teaching and learning. We're actually saying that speaking the truth and sharing an accurate narrative, again, about, because look, it is based in fact, the establishment of the state of Israel, how it happened, right? The War of Independence, how it happened, how we were attacked by our Arab neighbors. These things are based in fact. It's inarguable. But the one thing that is, again, it happened thousands of years ago, so it's sometimes harder to prove, is this notion that Jews are indigenous to the land of Israel. But again, this is what this definition talks about of anti-Palestinian racism, is that we have to.
Well, and listen, it was Hadrian, who was the Roman conqueror who renamed the
I don't know.
Hadrian renamed the area, the
Palestina.
Yeah, Palestina, and so like there's actually lots of evidence of our historical presence in the land. But I think what was confusing for me, notwithstanding that I thought I understood the education system, and from both a professional landscape and from a personal one with 4 kids, is that the DEI policies, which are sometimes called DEI policies or equity policies, and sometimes called code of conduct policies, they in fact are code of conduct policies. And there's 2 things that I found really shocking. One is we have centralized curriculum out of the province, right? The Ministry of Education centralizes the curriculum, and then the school boards are supposed to deliver the curriculum. But we don't have centralized human rights policies or equity policies. So every single school board, run by ostensibly teachers, so not people with human rights backgrounds, gets to make up policies kind of as they go along. And number 2, that they're not, like, I think for people in the business world, lots of businesses adopted DEI policies, and they were there to sort of frame a culture of acceptance and say, look, we are going to really do our best to be an inclusive environment, and we're developing a policy. It's not really going to impact hiring, although in some organizations it did, but we really just want to show how much we care. That's not the case in school boards. I mean, what we saw was that these equity policies were primacy. They overrun discipline, student safety. You know, we're dealing with families right now, by the way, who are not Jewish, because that's, you asked about the evolution of JEFA. There's no version of JEFA for non-Jewish parents. And so we have dozens of families contacting us every week who are not Jewish, who are asking for our help.
Wow.
And we have students who are repeatedly committing violent offensive, like assaulting another student to the point of 911 needing to be called and the other student passing out, right? Yep. But you don't get disciplined because of these equity policies. Phrases that we learned that we didn't know before: stigmatizing statistics, trauma-informed discipline. Response, but the trauma is not the victim of the assault. The trauma is the ancestral trauma that the aggressor student's family might have experienced. So
sorry, without like obviously getting into specific examples, but can you tell us what that looks like in practice? Like this, what you're talking about, where there's an issue, there should be discipline, there is no discipline because of DEI policies?
So I'll just deal with the one downtown school. There's a student who for several years, and this is a K-8 school, has been committing violent assaults. He even assaulted a teacher. He, in another incident, he tore through a classroom, causing tens of thousands of dollars worth of damage. So repeated. No suspensions for years, and his assaults are not dealt with in the same manner that they would be had he been from an oppressor group, right? And so that student just remains there. And you even have cases where when teachers have refrained students from assault, this isn't a Jewish issue, this is just a state of education today. When teachers have refrained students, pulled them back so they can't assault other students, those teachers are investigated and sometimes disciplined.
Right. And so it's sort of, it has to be a balancing act, right? If there are people who are committing, like you said, like real, they're causing incidents, assaults, destruction of classrooms, whatever, who are not being punished, then there also has to be, on the other side of that scale, there have to be the ones who are considered the oppressor groups who are being punished or unfairly treated without having done anything wrong too, right? So is there a way to sort of tell us a bit about what that looks like in practice? Do you have a story of like a Jewish student who's...
I mean, just going back to my own school and my own sort of reading of these policies, and when I recognize that this is what's taking place, right, is and talking about discipline and suspension in particular. So the TDSB produces a report every year that says like, oh, we suspended X number of students for this type of thing and Y number of students for that type of thing and so forth. And they also start to correlate different things, right? They say, oh, look at that, suspensions are higher within the student population that is in special needs programs. Oh, look, suspensions are higher in populations that come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, or oh, look, it's higher in people who have only one parent at home. Then they go on to say, oh, and let's do a race-based analysis. Ignoring all of those prior correlations, we will now come to the conclusion that we disproportionately suspend, and the TDSB's report specifically says this, they disproportionately suspend Middle Eastern and Black students. They do not control for any of the variables that they just showed correlate to suspensions. And so instead of saying, oh, look, this is, a complex, dynamic, socioeconomic and special education and all of these different factors at play, they ignore all of that.
And just boil it down
and just say, just look at race.
Right.
Oh, look at this. We disproportionately suspend Middle Eastern students. They don't control for things like, well, did those students commit offenses that were worthy of being suspended? And so they want to fix this. They think that this proves that they're racist and that they need to stop being so racist. So they need to try to equalize these suspensions. Right. The thing is you can't start suspending kids for something that they didn't do. So you need to just stop suspending kids for things that they did do despite those things warranting suspension.
Right.
And so then how that plays out in the school is then you have, and this is happened at my school, where you have an aggressor that falls within that, Middle Eastern category that they, say we intentionally intervene to stop the suspension of these students. That Middle Eastern student just targeted a Jewish student for months. Repeated anti-Semitic attacks, of physical violence, bullying, just horrific things, and the school just didn't didn't discipline that child because they don't want to contribute to these stigmatizing statistics. The suspension of that kid is the issue that that proves that there's racism in the system, not the 50 incidents of anti-Semitism that kid committed. Right. And so you have the Jewish students who are, talk about disproportionately the victim. And they are disproportionately being victimized, and they are not being protected because disproportionately the people who are perpetrating that are the ones being protected by the school board, not the victim.
So you have this cycle where schools appear to us to go out of their way not to record anti-Semitic related incidents in the portal, the hate portal, the incident portals, because they don't want those statistics there. And then in addition to that, even when those incidents are reported, then it is, the whole disciplinary approach is turned on its head. But now over the past few months, particularly the last 6 months of hearing from a lot of non-Jewish families, we see that Jewish students are not alone. They are disproportionately impacted, but by no means singularly impacted. Mm-hmm. In fact, I would describe and anti-Semitism has been described as the canary in the coal mine. It's like the first sort of, when anti-Semitism rise in a society, we know the likely economic downturn has already occurred or is occurring, shrinking middle class, a democracy on its decline. I would say that anti-Semitism is like a blood marker, like a biomarker. Men go for their PSA tests to see, how likely it is that they have prostate cancer. Well, anti-Semitic incidents in our school are kind of like the PSA test, right? It's telling us that we have a really big cancer in our education system.
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy. I'm definitely going to steal that and use it at some point. But I think it's important to understand, this isn't just a Jewish problem. This is going to be affecting the entirety of our of our community, of our society. I know we're jumping around a little bit, but on that note, I did want to just mention, jumping back over to APR for a second, that when the lawyers, I want to get the name right. It's
Arab
Canadian Lawyers Association. Thank you. When they cite examples of anti-Palestinian racism in their school board, they used a teacher, Javier Davila, who brought PFLP materials into the classroom, gave to students, promoted the concepts of martyrdom and other violent ideologies that don't belong in Canadian classrooms or in Canadian communities. So what we're dealing with isn't just about Jews, and so I'm trying to. It sounds like you're hearing from non-Jewish families who understand that, but do you think it's being, is the world picking that message up at all?
I think increasingly so, because I think that it does impact people, and people, you don't have a perfect view into what happens in schools, right? Your kid comes home and you say, how was school today? Great. Anything interesting happened? No. Right? And that's it. Right? So it's really hard to get a good glimpse into what's happening. But, people are picking up on little things, right? So one of the a recent incident was actually a non-Jewish person, right, who reached out to their school and said, why was there not a happy Easter message sent? I got a message for this holiday and that holiday and this holiday and this holiday, but nothing for Easter. And the response back was sort of along the lines of, check your privilege. It's enough about you.
No way.
Right. And so it's well, that's not right. How is that inclusion? And it goes back to this, it's the oppressor and oppressed dynamic. Why was that excluded? Well, because as per TDSB training, and I have the slide, it's a slide from the TDSB Human Rights Office. They went around training all of their staff on who the oppressors are. And they specifically listed Christians. Right. Christian white males are oppressors as per TDSB Human Rights Office training.
But you don't have to be. You could just be Christian and be an oppressor. You can be white and be an oppressor.
Oh no, for sure.
Right. Cisgender, you're an oppressor.
Jewish are oppressors.
Right? Yeah, they didn't list Jewish in that slide, but that one slide had speaking English without an accent makes you an oppressor.
Come on.
Yeah. Educational level of your parents makes you an oppressor, right? And so part of this is, there's a discussion in the Jewish community. Can we get worked into DEI? Yeah, sure we can. But then we have to kind of disband all of the Jewish values of resiliency and hard work. And, one of our earliest nicknames were people of the book, our love of learning, our love of education, right? What underpins the whole DEI metrics is student outcomes, high school graduation rates, right? And so the populations that disproportionately graduate are oppressors. The populations that disproportionately don't graduate are oppressed. The fact that Jewish students statistically face the most hate-motivated incidents, and notwithstanding that, they still graduate, mean they're even more oppressors, right? And so people need to understand that those three words, D, E, and I, diversity, equity, inclusion, that's not the metrics. The metrics is who graduates.
Right. Yeah, because I guess you said earlier that DEI was, I think you called it, like I wrote it down here, it was supposed to be a culture of acceptance.
Yeah.
Those were your words, right? And in the end, what it sounds like is acceptance for some at the expense of others. And again, like some people might argue and say, well, that's how it was for so long, and now we have to flip the narrative. And well, no, I mean, like, I'll give you that. There were periods of history where certain groups have been oppressed by other groups, and there needs to be, things have to be, there's consideration for that, right? But we can't now all of a sudden go completely in the other direction and make it now this exclusive space where people, and not just people, but huge groups of people, right? Like Christians are not a minority on this planet. To call Christians oppressors for being Christians is terribly bigoted.
Bigoted, but what does that do to a child? I think I'm experiencing this not just as someone who's doing advocacy in the community. As a parent, it's heavy on my kids when they come home and they're told that they bear responsibility for things that happened hundreds of years ago.
Right.
What does that do to our society?
Well, what does it do to your society also to tell people that just by being born this way, something is now your fault? It's okay to teach kids that, like, we have to talk about this, we have to learn about things that have happened in our past, fine. But and we do. Yep. If you go out on Canada Day, which was not so long ago, you see signs and yelling at people walking down the street. These people were born in the last 10 to 15 years. They have nothing to do with these stories at all. Even Germany, right? We're Jews. I don't know if you've been. I've been to Germany. I don't go there and think every German walking around the street is I'm sure many of their grandparents were Nazis. It's not their fault,
Correct.
That's right. And kids are not responsible for the anything that their ancestors did. But it's even that oversimplifies it also, right? It's like, oh, my kid gets treated worse because he's perceived as white, and historically somebody that looked like him was oppressive. But at the same time, that somebody that looked like him was oppressive to his people too.
Right.
Right? Like, what the hell?
Yeah.
So he's not just inheriting the sins of his ancestors. He's inheriting the sins of the people who picked on his ancestors.
Well, that's the Jewish experience, right? We say we're like the only group that's hated by the left and the right. And so it sort of is that same thing you're talking about right now, where it's like we're not good enough to be accepted by the white nationalists. We're not diverse enough to be accepted by the diverse, progressive left side, and we end up stuck in the middle just trying to survive and trying to find our footing. And unfortunately, it's hard to do that when people are actively trying to get rid of and erase our narratives, but more importantly, when DEI is just directly excluding us from the conversation. And I really liked what you said a few minutes ago about how it's not just about this, like, oh, Jews are being treated, anti-Semitic. It's like, no, this actually, DEI is antithetical to Jewish values of hard work and of honesty and truth, Justin Trudeau, when he got elected, he had his cabinet where he came out and said after the fact, I chose intentionally to have 3 women and 3 Hindus and 3, whatever it was. How did those people feel when they heard they were selected because they were a Hindu woman over the age of 40 rather than...
Tokenized.
Right.
Yeah. 6 years ago, my oldest son came home from school and told me that anti-Semitism doesn't exist. And I looked at him and I said, excuse me? And he said, we had a speaker at school today from an organization related to Black Lives Matter. And the speaker told, and he was in grade 4 at the time, I think. And the speaker told the gym, all the students in the gym, that the only form of racism was anti-Black racism, and that Black people couldn't be racist because racism is a social construct. Mm-hmm. And I just looked at him and I went, I have no idea what you are talking about, young man, but I think you heard wrong. I'm going to get to the bottom of this. And I called a mutual friend of ours. I called Rochelle Chester and I said, did my kid hear this right? And she goes, oh yeah, that's critical race theory. And I said, and this is in my son's school. And Rochelle really gave me an excellent education. And so I called the head of the school and I said, so I hear this is what happened. Did my son hear wrong? And the response was, no, he didn't hear wrong. And it's our mistake. And I'm thinking, okay, at this point in the conversation, we're going to say, and we'll send in a different speaker, or we'll have a conversation. It's our mistake. It's a long and complicated subject. And we just didn't leave enough time to fully explain it with the boys. And this was 6 years ago. And so this is...
So 6 years ago, before these things had become sort of like the forefront of all of our conversations.
People wonder...
And how old was he again?
Yeah, grade 4.
Grade 4.
Yeah. So
critical race theory being taught to a grade 4 student.
Okay, so let's stop for 1 second. I imagine that many of our viewers, have heard... Tell us, what is critical race theory? Can you... I know we've talked a bit about it already, but can you just, for our listeners, just sort of define it?
Racism is a social construct that can only people with power can be racist, and people without power, namely...
Yeah. So would you call it power, and I'm using that in quotes because it's very poorly defined, and the way in which it gets interpreted and implied comes from a very, I think, stereotypically driven perspective. It's all based on group power dynamics.
Yes.
Right? It's this group is more powerful than that group, and that is inherently not fair. It doesn't control for anything, right? It doesn't say, oh, well, this group has, a culture that emphasizes education or whatever other circumstances. It just says, oh, well, this group has more power than this group, and that's wrong. We need to
based on very specific stats, right? They just created sort of
very specific stats so I also have sort of a bit of a scientific background before I went into law, and it just drives me nuts. I will have conversations with people and I'll say, okay, that's an interesting statistic. What variables did you control for when coming to that conclusion? They don't even know what the hell I'm talking about. They don't know what controlling for variables mean, right? And so it's just this is just such shoddy work underneath the surface too.
And it was a fringe ideology in university campuses in the 70s, and it was a fringe-ish ideology, although gaining traction when we were at university. But what's shocking for me now, having done this work, is critical race theory is fully applied in the curriculum in Ontario. And it's fully applied through a policy called CRRP, Culturally Relevant and Responsive Pedagogy, which means notwithstanding whatever we're told to teach as teachers, and you have to remember that in Canada, teachers have absolute professional discretion under their license, which means they decide what learning resources to use. They decide how each subject is taught. So notwithstanding what we're supposed to be teaching under the curriculum, we have to make it culturally relevant and responsive, which means if I'm a grade 6 teacher and I were to be teaching the Holocaust, but I don't have Jewish students in the classroom, then the Holocaust isn't culturally relevant. I'm going to teach a different genocide. If I'm a teacher and I have a group of students who are struggling with math, and their cultural background doesn't hold that math is an important subject, then I'm going to skip math or I'm going to change the math curriculum because math is a colonial construct. Math is racist, just things that we hear now.
And I've actually heard that. I couldn't believe. I thought it was a joke.
I thought it was a joke too.
So can you explain that one? So they're saying it's racist. Why? Because certain people, children of certain backgrounds, don't have access to...
Because I've heard a couple of explanations. If our kids needed math, they would learn math, and forcing them to learn math is colonizing. We're colonizing them. Right. So we should decolonize math and then not force them. What have you heard?
Yeah, the decolonizing math, because it's
I'm sorry, I still even when you explain it to me, that doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand.
It doesn't
decolonize math.
I've heard the explanation that the colonizers came here by boats and therefore needed to know math in order to navigate, and so it's a skill that disproportionately colonizers would need. So we don't want to raise children to be colonizers, and therefore imposing math standards is colonizing.
I mean, I've been working this analyst for 3.5 years. I've heard a lot of crazy stuff in this space. That might be the craziest thing I've ever heard in my entire life.
And I've heard it in my own kids' parent-teacher interview. That's the mind-blowing thing.
And so this is the part that's the scariest, right? You're not hearing this from like loonies on the streets and protesting. No. You're hearing this from people who are supposed to be educating the next generation of our society.
Yes.
So what it's done is they've chosen to water down the academic curriculum with these DEI, critical race theory, all these things, which again are things that should be good and should be included, but it shouldn't be at the expense of education and of content that is effectively making our next generation stupider, I'm sorry to say, because we're not forcing educational standards on them at all. We're replacing curriculum with nonsense.
We're using it as a justification to lower the educational standards.
And so again, like, this might sound like a crazy conspiracy theory, whatever. We talk all the time about how foreign entities, governments, terror groups have funneled money into North America to permeate our college campuses with this ideology and this rhetoric. We've talked about how the Chinese government is involved with TikTok, which is being used to turn this middle generation into mush by sitting them on their phones like this and by controlling the content that they look at, right? So is it really that far cry to say that like all these DEIs and things that are being pushed into our academic system, what they're doing now, we can see, is making our people stupider?
One of the most chilling moments in doing this work was hearing from teachers about a month after October 7th. They had gone to a professional development conference hosted by OISE, which is the Faculty of Education at the University of Toronto. And that PD conference is one of the largest PD conferences for teachers in North America. And Jewish teachers left in horror. They were put into breakout rooms to talk about justified resistance. This is a month after October 7th at a PD conference
for educators
that their school boards paid for them to attend, that they got pay for attending, that the provincial government paid for both through its funding of the school boards and through its funding of the University of Toronto, that Race Relations Canada funded. When we looked on the website, so hidden in plain view, we looked at all the people thanked and acknowledged for funding this conference, and it was every layer of government. And then we looked at who the non-tax-based organizations were, and top at the list, literally hidden in plain sight, was the Center for Dean Studies, Dean being a synonym for Sharia law. So the Canadian Center for the Study of Sharia Law is the first named donor.
Partnered with all levels of our government.
And what was the conference called? The Decolonizing Conference.
Yeah, I've never watched. Again, I'm not that old. I haven't, but it's really stark to watch a society welcome in its own demise with open arms, right? To say like, yeah, let's talk about justified resistance and Intifada. We've seen now in the recent months what that's looked like. We've seen people killed in America. It's not a far cry to look at what's going to happen now with New York City and a lot of the things that are happening there. It's not a far cry to say that, this ideology has made its way here because we've welcomed it, because our governments have.
And I think also, to be fair though, it's intentionally subversive. It intentionally disguises itself, right? These are ideas that can't win in sort of an open free market of competing ideas. They have to be subversive. They have to hide behind virtuous concepts like diversity and equity and inclusion. Those are all things that everyone's normal definition of those words
anti-Palestinian racism.
That's great. Yeah, let's do that, right? But that's not what all of those terms have been redefined under the surface to essentially do the exact opposite, right? It has embedded itself into the system by hiding itself, by pretending to be something that it's not. And so, I completely agree with the point that you're making about how we've, welcomed this with open arms. But we've also, I think, unknowingly done so because it was packaged differently than really what it is.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Tamara.
Well, and we package it even for kindergarten students, like the board book. There's a board book in almost every school library in Toronto called P is for Palestine, and it's an alphabet book. I don't know if you had one for your kids, like A is for alligator, et cetera, et cetera. So this
for
one...
For my kids?
Yeah,
I don't have kids.
Sorry. Oh, I did.
Get the A for alligator, not the P is for Palestine.
So in the P for Palestine book, what do you think I is for?
Not Israel.
I is for Intifada.
No.
Oh.
I is for Intifada.
And this is a book that is read in kindergarten classrooms in Ontario?
It's in almost every school library in the TDSB. We found it in the PDSB.
See, but like, this is the most, you know?
And that's not the only book that's like dedicated or targeting kindergarten students.
Yeah.
There's lots of these like, let's learn to read types of books that are in our school libraries. One of them, I think it's called Baba, What Is My Name? And in that book, there's a picture of Israeli map, just like, you know, mapped over and labeled Palestine. But it also encourages the student, you know, let's draw a map of Palestine from the river to the sea. This is a kindergarten book intended to help kids to learn to read.
Yeah.
While subversively putting these ideas in their head, right? It is indoctrination.
When you look at anyone in Gaza that's been radicalized, you know, to fight for Hamas alongside Hamas, it's the same idea with UNRWA in those schools, putting this type of material in front of 5-year-old kids. This is what you get. You get a radical terror state on the border of a democratic state seeking its annihilation. How long, how many generations or decades? It's going to take a long time. But if we continue down this path, what happens to Canada when this is what we're teaching our students? Right. And we're teaching educators. I want to go back to this for a second about justified resistance at a conference.
Yeah.
This is Canada. We have law and order here. And our education system is being, I don't know what to say.
And it's not even just in Ontario. What was it, in Winnipeg? That there was a PD conference?
At a big hockey arena, and on the, what is it called?
Jumbotron.
The Jumbotron, right? Was, what did it say on the Jumbotron?
Also something along the lines of resistance is justified when you're oppressed, or something about justification of resistance. And
it's across the country. Ontario is unique in that Ontario sits as a leader in terms of education pedagogy. My mother recalls decades ago, PD days for teachers, for them to receive their professional development, was first rolled out on Ontario, then the rest of Canada, then into the United States. A lot of the zeitgeist, the ideas of how to approach education, some would argue indoctrination, are centered here before flowing outwards. But we see also Ontario as a testing ground for other ideologies to destabilize Jewish identity. It's not a coincidence that BDS started here in Ontario. This was the test market. Yep. Israel Apartheid Week started here in Ontario. And anti-Palestinian racism started here in Ontario. Another fact that we discovered early on that was really daunting to us was that the first PD session of anti-Palestinian racism for high school teachers in the TDSB was about 4.5 years ago. And it used all of the exemplars from the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association seminal paper on APR, but that paper hadn't been published yet. That paper got published 6 months later, right? So how were teachers in the TDSB trained on this material when that paper hadn't even been published?
And what did you find out?
We still have a lot of questions.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, it shows again, like, that there's a lot of the circumvention of otherwise stable policies and procedures in order to either work something like this into the education system or to work something out of it, like we talked about before with, you know, offenders, you know, of any kind in the TDSB sort of having, whether it's not reported at all or it's just handled differently than it would be according to code or policy because it's a certain type of student of a certain race, right? You know, it goes back to this whole notion of, like, anytime you say anti-Semitism, you've got to say Islamophobia as well, right? Where if you call somebody, if you say to a student, you're suspended because you made an anti-Semitic comment to a student, you know the mob is coming for you, that principle, to say, well, it's not anti-Semitic, it's legitimate criticism of Israel to say that that resistance is justified, like they have started to say these things with like zero shame, to say like that calling for this weekend in Glastonbury, that death to the IDF, that shouldn't be, this is a political statement, this isn't, incitement to violence. What are you talking about? It's like, I don't know if you saw the guy on Pierce Morgan, for example, who like literally was like, and then all of a sudden they watched the video and he's like, I don't really know how to defend that anymore. How we're seeing this in our school boards now, right?
We are like just even that example where you said, oh, this is an anti-Semitic, makes me think of, we've submitted a lot of Freedom of Information Act requests. And so one came back from the Peel District School Board. Where there was an incident where a student in class made some comments talking about how great Hitler was. And so that student was it was just in the course of or actually I don't even think it was in the course, they like stood up in the middle of the class to sort of shout out and share their thoughts on how great Hitler was. And so the teacher in that class, I think the teacher handled it well, right? Took the kid aside and was going through disciplinary proceedings because of that. And then the equity office got involved because it was, it was flagged as anti-Semitic. And so that's when the equity office comes in to they are supposed to help deal with hate incidents. And the equity office told them, no, that's not anti-Semitic. It depends on the context. Sure, Hitler did some bad things, but like also he probably did some good things too. And you don't know what specifically the student was talking about, so like you can't really just infer that they only meant the bad stuff. Like when they're talking about how Hitler was good, maybe they meant the good stuff. And so that's not anti-Semitic. Mm-hmm. And the teacher felt the need to write in their notes. And I know because we have the notes, they wrote in their notes, they quoted the equity person as saying, I'm telling you it's not anti-Semitic. Because even the teacher knew that was just total BS. Totally. Like this is not being handled well. The equity office is wrong. And so the teacher intentionally documented that in their notes because the teacher knew that it was wrong. But like this is
when Aaron talks about equity being brought in, so it's not discipline. Like when we were kids, right? You did something like that, the principal got called in, or maybe the superintendent. No, it's the equity office. And how is the equity office designed? It's segregation. So black students have a black equity officer, Muslim students have a Muslim equity officer, Jewish students, if they're lucky in their board, have a Jewish equity officer, which means that one Jewish equity league has the responsibility for all the anti-Semitic incidents for the whole board. And could you imagine what it's like for them? They push too hard. Are they going to get fired? Are they going to be investigated? Right? And how do they handle that scope of work, right? And again, equity is about then coming in and re-educating the students. Like we're not dealing with disciplinary issues at this point. It's by design. We have our Jewish kids in these systems where the equity calendar disproportionately favors other identities, right? You have October being Islam Awareness Month, February being Black Excellence Month, June at the end of the year during exams is May, Jewish Heritage Month and Asian Heritage Month. So the calendar is designed to minimize exposure to Jewish identity. Then you have the resources being designed to minimize exposure. Things like Holocaust education are often considered in school boards to be part of like identity affirming as opposed to history, right? So then Jewish kids' identity is about how they were mass slaughtered by the millions, right? And so when people say, but we want to be worked into DEI, do we want to be worked into this system? Is this the system that we want our kids exposed to?
And yeah, and I was going to just say that it's a very similar kind of question to what we were saying before. Like, it's not about, what's right or wrong for the Jewish community. It's about what's right or wrong for humanity at large. And if we don't believe in what DEI is accomplishing, and we don't believe in the merit of the structure at large, then we shouldn't just say, well, if you'll accept us, we'll come in. If you can just put us on the other list, if you can call us the oppressed instead of the oppressors, then we'll join you, because that's how the whole world has fallen to this point, is that people are afraid of the mob, and they say, well, you know what, fine. If you just don't come for us, we'll fall in online and we'll say what you want us to say. And the board is doing that right now, right? That's effectively what's happening, is we're seeing many boards across the world effectively that are afraid of the mob.
Absolutely.
100%.
And so what does that look like in practice? Like, we've talked a lot about, trainings, resources, things that have been sort of snuck into board materials. But what about in the classroom? How is this type of ideology making its way into the student space, and that overreach that's being allowed by DEI? How is that presenting itself?
That's a really great question, especially in the context of this week, because just a few days ago in Ontario, the Minister of Education announced that he was placing 5 school boards under direct supervision, which means that he's appointing the CEO who's going to run those organizations. And those 5 boards, while he might be saying, it's 5 out of 72 boards, that's actually 30% of students in Ontario are now in school boards under direct supervision. And so there are people in the Jewish community who are breathing a sigh of relief, and this is going to be the beginning of the end. But sadly, it's not, because it's really, there's 3 or 4 pillars in education. One, or sort of operational vessels. So one is the school board, but the other 3 are the teachers union, the Ministry of Education, as well as the regulator in Ontario is the College of Teachers. So teachers unions have now actually become board partners and authorized partners to the College of Teachers to provide AQ courses. That means we have the teachers unions responsible for the professional development, in many cases, of teachers in Ontario. And we've talked about the problematic zeitgeist within the teachers unions. In the Ministry of Education, we've talked about the fact that CRRP, culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, which is the application of critical race theory, is in fact embedded in a lot of the curriculum in Ontario. And in fact, sometimes more than embedded. There's that grade 12 course.
Entire courses about it.
There's an entire course about teaching jihad as spirituality. What was that course?
Yeah, I forget the name of the course, but yes, there's a course in the Ontario curriculum where it specifically says, teach jihad it's misrepresented in the media, and instead you need to correct that and teach that it is a spiritual struggle.
It's like just deception after deception after deception. They just say, how do we find a way to repurpose or repackage our beliefs into a way that is palatable and digestible? Not only palatable and digestible for Western democracy, but also in a way that will induce feelings of guilt on Westerners, right? That they read this and they say, it's like, oh yeah, you know what, the Palestinian liberation, the spiritual struggle, it's like, that exists. There are many Palestinians who are refugees, but jihad is not that. And jihad is also not just only directly linked to Palestine. I mean, I guess that's what they're saying in this case.
It's a lot like the trying to rebrand, globalize the Intifada as meaning something other than violence.
Right. Yeah, just like the word Intifada itself, it's like we've got a long history.
Yeah, let's globalize the Intifada. I didn't mean violence, even though every Intifada previously was defined by extreme violence.
But that's what we see, is like everything is just being flipped on its head. Like same thing with the War of Independence in 48. Is like now they are pushing through anti-Palestinian racism this notion that if you deny, they want to make it illegal in the context of the TDSB to say that the Jews were attacked by the Arabs rather than that the Arabs were attacked by the Jews.
That's right.
And they found a way to do it. They found a way to tell people, for people to say, well.
And then the other pillar in education is the regulator. And the regulator's statutory responsibility is to uphold confidence in the teaching profession and ensure that licensing standards are upheld.
Right.
But we had recently the case of a teacher who's been subject to discipline because she posted on social media that you either stand, this was like 5 days after October 7th, you either stand with Israel or you stand with terrorism. And they
didn't like the word terrorism because somehow what they've done again is inverted this, like terrorism means Palestinians, not Hamas, not Yemen, not the Houthis. Sorry.
But make no mistake, I mean, this is the same regulator where the community has submitted dozens, if not hundreds, of complaints and demands for investigation of teachers who've posted blood libel, genocide, skin bank on their social media. And to put it into context, the very first teacher in Ontario that ever lost their license under the nascent Ontario College of Teachers, this was like 25 years ago, was a teacher by the name of Paul Frum, who attended neo-Nazi conferences on the weekend. He never brought any neo-Nazi information into class. So the College of Teachers at that time decided that his outside of classroom affiliation with neo-Nazism was enough to revoke his license. But today, it's not. Posting that Israel is a skin bank, or that image that we've all seen now that the Israeli flag is the same as the Nazi flag. This teachers can do with impunity, and the regulator has yet to act. And it's the same regulator that opened up its annual general meeting this year saying that they're ready to do more work on DEI, and they're ready to roll out DEI mandatory certification for teachers in Ontario. So that the connection here, can't be ignored.
Yeah. Essentially what you're saying, just to, to simplify things a little bit, is that, Jewish teachers, students, pro-Israel folks in the board are being treated, unfairly and being, punished disproportionately for things, whereas the other side is not, again, all as a result of DEI protocols, procedures, probably some inherent anti-Semitism as well, but really just the notion that a Jewish teacher is nowhere near as protected as a pro-Palestinian teacher or anyone else who, again, even if they are white, has maybe found a way to say, okay, it's LGBTQ or it's this or it's that makes them jump from the oppressor to the oppressed category. Anyways, all this to say that this is a big question, but what do we have to do? What has to be done? Like, I know that you guys, you're doing great work. I think we're doing great work. I think a lot of people are doing great work, but as it relates specifically to the TDSB, for our teachers and our students, what has to be done?
I would say more broadly than the TDSB, because it's the whole education system. I think that we have to understand that we're in wartime. Israel is at war, and we're at war here. And when we were in the ghettos and we were mounting our resistance, we didn't pay other organizations to fight for us. We all picked up arms and we all fought. And that's not to say that Stand With Us and JEFA doesn't appreciate a donation. We do, and we're doing our best work. But this isn't a period where people can offload advocacy to organizations. This is a period where everyone has to be an advocate. Every single person in the community and every single person who cares about education and the future of the country.
Yeah. And I think in those advocacy efforts, I think that we really need to go back to equal rights movement.
Absolutely.
I don't think that we have that in Canada anymore. We need to go back to, judging people based on their character instead of the color of their skin or their ethnicity or whatever. And I think that we need to focus. I think we need to reinforce Canadian values. Enough of this, Canada's a terrible genocidal state, right? Like there's a lot to be proud of to be a Canadian, and we're losing that in our schools right now. And then I think also focusing back on core subjects, like all of this extra. Why is it that teachers have more professional development on how to decolonize math than how to teach math, right? Like there's a reason we're seeing our math scores go down. It's because we aren't focusing on math. We're focusing on what's wrong with math, and without actually being able to properly articulate anything that is actually wrong with it, right? It's just this idea of, colonization is bad, right? And so we really, I think, need to go back to the basics.
I have so much to say about all that. So the first thing is test scores are objectively, factually down across the board in Ontario. Is this a thing?
Yes.
So not just EQAO scores, but something called PISA scores, which are the internationally ranked academic scores. So our scores are down in Ontario. They're specifically down in the TDSB. And PISA scores are down as well.
And is this a consistent trend we're seeing, just dropping year after year kind of deal, or at least staying?
And notably, the countries that have adopted DEI and CRRP, culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, into their education zeitgeist have also experienced decline in PISA scores. So
there's a correlation between those two things, a direct correlation, because again, we've talked about the importance of data and doing studies in the right way. There's because I haven't looked into that. I'd be fascinated to see those numbers.
Talk to Stephen Reach. He's just a phenomenal expert. He's he is a lawyer who decided on a second career, and God bless him, went back to OISE to do a master's and now a PhD in pedagogy. And he's emerging as one of the worldwide experts in DEI in our education system, and he knows this subject matter very well.
Okay, I'm gonna have to look into that as well. I also wanted to just touch on what you're saying about the core subjects. I think it's fascinating to think about, like, again, if you looked at data, I would imagine that the world is probably in the best shape, not today, but in let's say a 10-year period that it's ever been throughout history. If you looked at advancements in medicine, science, technology, mortality rates, I would imagine the world is in pretty good shape overall. And I find it fascinating to think about the things that got us here, math, science, language arts, social studies, all those things that were fundamental to building society are now, like, I talk to kids. I worked for 8 years as the youth director at a synagogue, and I have some, sometimes I still stay in touch. Sometimes I hear the classes that they're taking, like, oh, how's school? And they'll tell me, sorry, what? Like, this is not a course that was ever, it sounds like underwater basket weaving or something as far as I'm concerned, right? Like, it's just not things that build societies. And again, like, just going back to our point before, we sort of started by saying all this too, right? That, like, we have to focus on the things that make us stronger and smarter and safer. And right now, TDSB is really focusing on the opposite, right? They're bringing in dangerous ideology.
And it's not just the TDSB.
Sorry, I know I'm just focused because we're here. But
it is. I mean, it is the TDSB, but quite frankly, Waterloo Region had a candidate post. I think it was Waterloo Region District School Board that blamed Canada for its historic, horrible track record in slavery. We didn't have slavery, but and a bunch of other things. I think it was also Waterloo Region that outlawed the word family, right? Because it was a colonial construct and so racist.
I think it was the same school board.
I think so. It could have been a different one.
Board, yeah.
Right? I think that's kind of the point. The point is that I keep saying TDSB, but it's not. It's really academia, it's DEI, it's CRT.
And it's private schools.
Yep.
So in the last year, one of the most gruesome events was the NAIS, the National Association of Independent Schools, which is an association for independent schools in the United States. But CASE, the Canadian Association of Independent Schools, is the sister organization here in Canada. NAIS held a conference, I think it was in Denver, called the People of Color Conference. It's our largest DEI conference for teachers, and it was so horrific and so anti-Semitic that it made it onto not just the New York Post and like all the Jewish publications, but CNN and the New York Times. This is how vile, and NAIS has had to decide to cancel. That was a 5-year running long conference. They've canceled the conference now for the time being because that DEI conference was so hateful and specifically so anti-Semitic. And there were many schools in Toronto and in Canada that sent several teachers to that conference.
Yeah. And that's why, like, this is a huge problem. Like, the first thing you said when I asked you of how do we fix this, you said we can't offload advocacy. And again, that goes back to the beginning too. We talked about how parents don't typically understand policies, procedures. They also don't know, like you were talking about the 3 pillars, the not moderator, what was the last, the regulator, right?
Yes.
Like, people don't know what a regulator is, what the expectations of a regulator are, who is regulating the regulator. Whoops, sorry about that. We need people to not offload their advocacy. It's not even just about like just donating to JEFA and saying let them take care of it. It's also inform yourselves on like what the policies are around your children's education and stand up when you don't think that what they're hearing in their classrooms is okay, and make sure, because I want to just like really raise this as like it's a huge problem facing our community because it's deteriorating by the day.
Yes.
Right? It's not just that we're here and this is now life. It's getting worse every day, and we need to speak up and we need to make sure that we know exactly what's going on. So the last thing, because we do have to wrap up soon and I want to get to the end, but I want to ask that last question again. I asked, what can we do about it? And we had all sorts of great answers, but one of them you mentioned focusing on equal rights, and again, that sounds to me sort of like the opposite of DEI.
That's right.
Right? So, so what does that look like in practice? I mean, like, not that the three of us at this table can go out and abolish DEI and replace it with, equal rights, but what is it that...
Well, we can. But that's the thing.
So tell me. me. What has to happen? What has to happen?
I think the thing that Aaron and I, like, every day we kind of are like, it's this yin and yang, super daunted by the number of emails and phone calls and the amount of work. But then when we look back over the past 18 months, we're also feel buoyed by the amount of change, discussion. I mean, even things like we've done tons of briefings for the various ministers of education, etc. We're quite buoyed by what appears to be a change in direction. It's premature to celebrate, completely premature. So I would say that don't underestimate the power of one email, right? And copy that email to the highest powers. Recently, we were on an email exchange with some other Jewish organizations because they've discovered what we'd long discovered, which is the federal government has a printed or a published wheel of privilege. And this wheel of privilege is scary. It shows where sort of social capital rests in our society by being closer to the center, right? And so, like, you want to be not cisgender, you want to be not white, you want to be not male, etc., etc. And this is a publication by the federal government really granting unequal rights in this country. And it's used in our schools, it's used to train our educators, it's used to train our students. Everybody has the power to email their MP and say, this is enough. We want to go back to the charter and we want to go back to equal rights. And the federal government has to stop this type of ideology from permeating into our society. And so that's one thing people can do right now. They can have that discussion. I would say number two, and this is me speaking as an advocate both for people with disabilities and in education advocacy, is kind of like, take a deep breath and just do the right thing. Don't be scared. Don't be scared. What's the worst thing that's going to happen? Your kid's teacher isn't going to like you?
Right.
So what? Right? You need to think about, like, earning your child's respect and doing the right thing and
teaching your child to do the right thing and modeling that behavior for your child, to say 100%. To them, like, we need to be a people, not Jews, Western democracy, freedom-loving people. We need to be people that believe in that if you work hard, you will earn and you will succeed. You will find yourself where you want to be in life, right? It isn't about white, black, this, that, or the other thing. It's about, like, we all live by a set of values, which are that hard work will end up, paying off. Good behavior will put you in the right position. Destructive, bad behavior will deter your future, goals. It will put a roadblock in front of you. And I think that's the biggest problem. And I wonder if, like most things in life, a pendulum will eventually sort of swing back. But we need people to, like you said, to speak up, to send that email, to, to do all those things.
But kudos to you for having this discussion, because other organizations are fearful of having this discussion. They're fear of being canceled, of not having politicians and leaders take their meetings. There's no more time for that fear.
No.
Right? Like, there is a special moral obligation right now, especially in the Jewish community, because let's be honest, a lot of members of the Jewish community in Canada are wondering if it's time to leave.
Yeah, it is. It's a conversation that I hear all the time, and in many cases, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. You know what I mean? And unfortunately, we need to. It's very easy to just book a flight. I'm not married. I don't have kids. Like, we could just go right now, and it wouldn't be too much trouble. But I'm not really willing to do that. Like, and you're not either. There's so many people here that are in this moment of saying, like, we need to stand up and speak up and reverse the tide, because we can. It's not a fight that we have and no chance of winning. We just need to speak up. We need to inform ourselves. We need to understand who our friends and our allies, who we can work with. That's actually the most important thing the Jewish community has to stop doing, is sort of the infighting and the division between groups. We have to understand that there's a role for everybody to play, from the UJA down to the smallest of grassroots. There's a role for everyone there in the middle. And one more thing, if I can just say that I'll have this conversation all day because it has to be had, right? It's something that has to be said. And the reason most people are not doing it is because they're afraid of, like you said, being canceled, this, that, whatever. I'm not saying anything. I have to be rooted in my beliefs that I am a good person and that my organization is a good organization, that is staffed by good people. And so we don't believe in Palestinian racism. We are anti-Palestinian racism.
Correct.
We are just anti that policy as it is written in a way that erases Jewish history. And it's the same thing with other movements in the past that have great roots, but were perverted by their leadership in order to go and attack others rather than actually just fighting for themselves. And I think that we as an organization understand that, and we say, like, look, we know we're not bad people, and if you want to comment on this video and say, you know, what equal rights you don't believe, we'll explain it to them. No, we do. We want everyone to be prosperous.
Yeah, that's right.
That's it.
It's the craziest thing. Yeah. Be called a racist for advocating for equal rights for everybody.
Right. Exactly.
Right. Yep. And that's the beauty of equal rights. Equal rights gives equal rights to Palestinian children and to black children and to white children and to Jewish children. And what about all the children who are all of those things in one pot, right? A bit of this, a bit of that. It's about equal rights for everyone. And so I would say, if there's one more thing, when people are working with the various organizations in the Jewish community and beyond, especially have discussions before you write that check about where the organization stands with respects to equal rights.
Yep.
And are they public on that stand, and do they walk the walk on that stand? Unfortunately, one of the things that we've experienced over the past 18 months is that a lot of the advocacy work and the public advocacy work we've done has ended up inadvertently creating more funding for some Jewish organizations for DEI programs, which has, you know, it's like this bad circle, right? This cycle. And we want to get out of that cycle. Let's all work together for an equal rights movement.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And again, Jews need to speak up for Jews. We've learned through this whole process, especially in school boards, that no one is going to speak for us if we don't speak for ourselves. And this is one of those moments where we need the community to stand up and speak up. So I feel like this conversation could have gone on forever.
For a long time.
I feel like we skimmed the surface of DEI, the surface of APR, and lots of things. But I do hope that those who listened, you know, feel like they were a little bit better informed on those subjects after hearing from the two of you today. So I want to thank you for joining us. Where can people learn more about JEFA, find out more about JEFA, what you're doing, follow along? Are you know, social media, websites?
So we do. We have Twitter, JEFA Canada. We have Instagram, JEFA Canada. We have a website. To be honest with you, like, there's not a ton of content on the website because really, first of all, you can't lay public, you know, all the work we do for policy stuff, but also really what we do is our online courses, right, that you've been spearheading with, you know, understanding education policy. And at the first, parents were like, what do I need to understand about education policy? And it's kind of like,
you have to understand about education policy. If you have kids in school, if you have friends with kids in school, this is something we have to learn. We have to get to understand better because, you know, it's going to impact, sorry, you know what, I take it back. Even if you don't have kids in school, the way that our society is being educated,
that's right.
This is going to impact, they're going to be our politicians, our business leaders, all these people. And so even if you aren't ever going to have kids, this is going to affect you.
This ideology is, again, like, if it just competed in the free marketplace of ideas, I think it would lose, right? It's subversive, it hides, it presents it something else, and it specifically targets children and vulnerable people like that, right? It specifically indoctrinates children when they don't have the capacity to critically think about it, right? When they don't have that underlying foundation of everyone is equal and deserving of respect, and it puts these ideas in their head, and then they grow up to be the future politicians and the business leaders, and they have this you know, distorted worldview because it was indoctrinated into them as children, right?
Distorted worldview and a completely I cut you off. I was gonna say a distorted worldview and a completely revised understanding of history, you know? So anyways, Tamara, Aaron, thank you both so much. It was really lovely chatting with you. I'm sure maybe we'll have you on again because I would love to, like, really, the APR stuff is fascinating. There's so much in there that I think people aren't aware of. So I would really also encourage people to go and to read about APR, to go to the ACLA's website and, you know, read their definition of APR. Read the examples they cite as APR. You know, like, it's racist to condemn somebody for talking about Intifada in their classroom or martyrdom in their classroom or in a PD session.
And then one plug, go to the JEFA website, and there is one page with our House of Commons submissions. When last June, the Standing Committee on Racism had those committees looking at anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and look at the JEFA submissions. We were the only organization to submit on behalf of Jewish educators, and we were the only Jewish organization to submit on APR. And the document that we did was literally teachers and students in their own words. just quotes. So go and see what it's like by reading that document. And it was shocking then, and it's more shocking now.
I think a big takeaway for everyone is to go out and to read, and to actually like invest your time, not to read summaries, but to go in to look at the bones behind the template, right? And to understand what these things mean. And you ever need help with it, JEFA is going to be there to help you. Stand With Us Canada as well. Anything to do with these issues. If there's things that you want clarity on, send us an email. Ask us for help. We want to be there for the communities. So I'll thank you one more time, Tamara, Aaron, appreciate it.
Thank you.
And all of you for listening, and we will see you next episode.
Mm-hmm.